HOA bulldozed my disabled sister's ramp, unaware she's a powerful state official. What started as a simple accessibility issue turned into one of the most satisfying cases of karma I've ever witnessed. This is the story of how our local HOA's petty power trip led to their complete downfall. Some background. My sister has been wheelchair-bound since a car accident 12 years ago. Despite this, she's never let her disability hold her back. She went on to law school, got into politics, and is now one of our state's most respected public officials. I couldn't be prouder of her determination and success. When she moved into my neighborhood last year to be closer to family, I was thrilled. We found her a perfect single-story house just 3 doors down from mine. The HOA initially seemed accommodating when we submitted plans for a wheelchair ramp. They approved the design and we had it professionally installed following all 80 guidelines. The contractor even matched the ramp's color and materials to the house exterior. Everything was fine for the first 6 months. Then the HOA board had an election, and that's when the trouble started. The new board president was one of those people who thought they were appointed by God to protect property values. Within weeks, she started sending my sister violation notices about the ramp. The first letter claimed the ramp disrupted the architectural harmony of the neighborhood. My sister responded with copies of the original approval and ADA compliance documentation. A week later, another notice arrived saying the ramp's handrails were unsightly and needed to be removed. Again, my sister explained these were required by law for safety. I tried reasoning with the board at their monthly meeting. The ramp was approved by the previous board, I explained. It's necessary for my sister's access to her home and complies with all regulations. The president just sniffed dismissively. The previous board made many mistakes that we're correcting. That ramp is an eyesore that's bringing down everyone's property values. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Are you seriously suggesting that my sister's ability to enter her own home is less important than your aesthetic preferences? Your sister's situation is unfortunate, she replied with fake sympathy, but she knew this was an HOA neighborhood when she moved in. Rules are rules. I left that meeting fuming but figured we'd just have to put up with their harassment. My sister was surprisingly calm about it, saying she'd dealt with worse discrimination before. We had no idea what they were planning. Last Tuesday, I got a frantic call from my sister's caregiver while I was at work. "They're tearing down the ramp," she shouted. I went out to get the mail, and there's a crew with machinery ripping it apart. I rushed home immediately. By the time I arrived, the ramp was completely demolished. Pieces of it were scattered across the lawn, and there was visible damage to my sister's front porch where they'd ripped it out. The HOA president was standing there supervising with a smug smile on her face. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I demanded. "Enforcing our bylaws," she replied calmly. "Your sister was given multiple notices to remove this unauthorized structure. Since she failed to comply, the HOA removed it at her expense. She'll be billed for the demolition costs." I was literally shaking with rage. This was an approved modification. You can't just destroy someone's property like this. And how exactly is my sister supposed to get into her house now? She shrugged. That's not the HOA's concern. She should have thought about that before refusing to follow our rules. I pulled out my phone to call the police, but she just laughed. "Go ahead. We have every right to remove violations from properties in our jurisdiction. Your sister can take it up with our lawyers if she has a problem with it." What this power-drunk HOA president didn't know was that my sister isn't just any disabled homeowner they could bully. She's the state's deputy attorney general, specializing in civil rights and disability law, and she was about to rain holy hell down on this HOA. I called my sister at her office and explained what happened. There was a long pause before she spoke. "Send me pictures of everything," she said in that scary calm voice she uses when she's furious. "Then call our contractor and get an estimate for a new ramp. Document all the damage. I'll handle the rest." Over the next few hours, I took dozens of photos and videos. The contractor came out and was appalled at the destruction. He estimated at least $12,000 in damage between the demolished ramp and the damaged porch structure. My sister had to be carried into her house by two neighbors that evening. It was humiliating for her and infuriating for me to watch. But she just smiled and said, "Don't worry. This will all work out exactly as it should." The next morning, three things happened in rapid succession. A team of HOA compliance investigators showed up to document the violation. 2. State building inspectors arrived to review the HOA's demolition permits. Spoiler, they didn't have any. 3. My sister's office filed an emergency injunction against the HOA. By noon, news vans were parked along our street. Turns out, HOA illegally demolishes Deputy Attorney General's wheelchair ramp, makes for quite a headline. The story went viral almost immediately. The HOA president tried to do damage control, claiming they were unaware of my sister's position. That only made things worse. Discriminating against any disabled person is illegal, regardless of their job. But the fact that they'd done this to a high-ranking state official who specializes in disability law made them look especially foolish. Would you like me to continue with what happened next? The state's investigation revealed a pattern of discriminatory behavior by the HOA. They'd been selectively enforcing rules against elderly and disabled residents, pressuring them to either modify their homes or move out. My sister's ramp was just the latest example. The media coverage sparked outrage across the state. Disability rights organizations organized protests outside our HOA office. The governor himself issued a statement condemning their actions. Local realtors reported that home values in our neighborhood were actually dropping because no one wanted to buy into an HOA that was becoming synonymous with discrimination. The HOA president finally resigned after her own workplace suspended her pending an ethics investigation. She was, ironically, an HR manager at a large company. The remaining board members quickly approved an emergency measure to rebuild my sister's ramp at the HOA's expense. But my sister wasn't done yet. She used this incident to push through new state legislation she'd been working on. The Residential Accessibility Protection Act would make it illegal for HOAs to restrict reasonable accommodations for disabled residents. It passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. The final tally of consequences for the HOA: $50,000 in fines for ADA violations, $25,000 for illegal demolition without permits, $12,000 to rebuild the ramp and repair damage, $100,000 in civil penalties for discrimination, required sensitivity training for all board members, 5 years of state oversight and quarterly compliance audits, legal fees that nearly bankrupted their reserve fund. They also had to send a formal written apology to every homeowner in the neighborhood and post it publicly in the community center. The new board is now required to have at least one member who is either disabled or an immediate family member of a disabled person. My sister's new ramp was installed last week. It's actually nicer than the original one, with better lighting and a gentler slope. The contractor added some lovely landscaping around it too. Every time I see the HOA president's house up for sale with no takers, I smile thinking about how their property value concerns backfired spectacularly. But the best part? At the most recent HOA meeting, they announced a complete overhaul of the architectural review process. Now, instead of worrying about aesthetic harmony, they're focused on making our neighborhood more accessible and inclusive for everyone. Several other homeowners have already submitted plans for accessibility modifications that would have been rejected under the old board. My sister says this story is a reminder that discrimination often hides behind seemingly neutral rules about property values and community standards. But when people stand up against it, real change is possible. As for me, I've learned that karma sometimes needs a little help from the justice system. And it's always satisfying to watch bullies realize they picked the wrong person to mess with. Edit. Wow, this blew up overnight. Thanks for all the supportive comments. To answer some common questions. Yes, my sister is doing great and loving her new ramp. The former HOA president still hasn't sold her house and had to drop the price again. 3 other HOAs in our area voluntarily changed their accessibility policies after this incident. My sister is working on expanding the new law to other states. Edit 2. My sister says to remind everyone that if you experience housing discrimination due to disability, document everything and report it to your state's civil rights office. Don't let HOA bully you into giving up your rights. Some people are asking why we didn't tell the HOA about my sister's position right away. Simple, we shouldn't have had to. The right to accessible housing doesn't depend on someone's job title or connections. The HOA was wrong regardless of who my sister was, and that's the point she wanted to make. I'll post another update soon about some interesting developments with the state's ongoing investigation into other HOA complaints that came to light because of this incident. Let's just say this might have been just the tip of the iceberg. Update. Hold on to your hats, because the aftermath of this situation has been absolutely wild. It's been 6 months since my original post, and so much has happened that I hardly know where to begin. First, remember how I mentioned the state was investigating other HOA complaints? Well, that investigation uncovered a massive web of discrimination that went way beyond just our neighborhood. Turns out our former HOA president was part of a consulting group that advised other HOA on how to maintain property values, which was basically code for pushing out residents they didn't want. The investigation found evidence that this group had helped at least 12 other HOA in our state implement discriminatory policies disguised as aesthetic guidelines. They specifically targeted homes with modifications for elderly or disabled residents, claiming things like wheelchair ramps, support railings, and medical equipment disrupted community standards. My sister's office obtained their email records, and some of the messages were absolutely shocking. Here's an actual quote from our former HOA president to another board. "If we make compliance expensive and difficult enough, these people will eventually give up and move somewhere more appropriate for their situation." The state filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of all affected residents. Last week they announced a settlement, $2.5 million in damages to be paid to discriminated homeowners, plus mandatory oversight for all HOA that use this consulting group. But wait, it gets better. Remember how our former HOA president couldn't sell her house? Turns out there was a reason beyond just the bad publicity. During the investigation, they discovered she had lied on her original mortgage application and had been embezzling from the HOA's reserve fund for years. She was arrested last month and is now facing federal fraud charges. When they forensically audited the HOA's books, they found she had stolen over $180,000 through fake maintenance contracts with shell companies she controlled. That's why she was so aggressive about fining residents. She needed to keep money flowing in to cover her theft. The FBI got involved because she'd been running this scheme across multiple HOA. They raided her consulting office and found evidence that she'd been teaching other HOA boards how to hide similar embezzlement through inflated contractor bills and bogus fines. She's currently out on bail awaiting trial, but her problems are far from over. The IRS is now investigating her for tax evasion, and 3 other HOA have filed civil suits to recover stolen funds. Her husband filed for divorce after discovering she'd mortgaged their house without his knowledge to cover her legal fees. As for our neighborhood, the changes have been amazing. The new HOA board, led by a retired civil rights attorney who uses a mobility scooter, has completely transformed how things work here. They've implemented a universal design initiative that actually encourages accessibility modifications. They're even offering matching funds to help residents install ramps, handrails, and other adaptive features. Property values have actually increased because we're now known as one of the most accessible and inclusive communities in the area. My sister's new state law is already having a huge impact. 17 other HOA in our state have voluntarily revised their architectural guidelines to be more accessibility friendly. 3 neighboring states have introduced similar legislation, and my sister has been invited to testify before their state legislatures. The media attention also sparked a national conversation about HOA reform. Several major newspapers have run investigative series about discriminatory HOA practices, and Congress is now considering federal legislation to strengthen oversight of HOA. Last weekend, our neighborhood had a community cookout to celebrate all the positive changes. The turnout was incredible. Residents who'd felt isolated or unwelcome under the old regime were finally comfortable participating in community events. There were people of all ages and abilities enjoying themselves together. The coolest part? A group of local contractors who specialize in accessibility modifications set up information booths at the event. They're offering discounted rates to our residents for adaptation projects, and the new HOA board is fast-tracking approval for these modifications. Some other interesting developments. The former HOA presidents' consulting clients are falling like dominoes. 3 other HOA boards have been forced to resign after evidence of discrimination and financial misconduct came to light. Our state legislature just passed another bill my sister championed that requires HOA to have their financial records independently audited annually. They're calling it the Community Trust and Transparency Act. The contractor who originally installed my sister's ramp and rebuilt it after the demolition has become the go-to expert for accessible home modifications in our area. He's now teaching other contractors how to work with HOA to ensure compliance while maintaining accessibility. Remember that snooty realtor who backed up the HOA's claims about property values? She lost her license after the investigation revealed she had been steering disabled home buyers away from certain neighborhoods. The former HOA president's criminal trial is set for next month. Based on the evidence that's been made public so far, she's looking at serious prison time. Several of her former consulting clients have agreed to testify against her in exchange for lighter sentences. My sister says this case has become required reading in several law schools' civil rights courses. She's been invited to give guest lectures about how this one incident exposed systemic discrimination in HOA practices nationwide. As for me, I'm just happy to see my sister able to easily access her home again. Her new ramp has become a symbol of positive change in our community. Sometimes the neighbors decorate it for holidays. Last Christmas it was strung with lights, and for Pride Month it was draped with rainbow banners. The most satisfying part? Every time a moving truck shows up in the neighborhood now, there's a good chance it's bringing in a new resident who chose our community specifically because of our inclusive policies. We've become known as a place where everyone is welcome, regardless of their needs or abilities. I've learned that sometimes it takes one person standing up to injustice to create lasting change. My sister didn't just win her own battle, she sparked a movement that's making housing more accessible for countless others. That's what real justice looks like. Edit 3. Thanks for all the awards and supportive comments. To address some questions. Yes, I'll update again after the criminal trial. My sister is writing a book about disability rights and housing discrimination. Several residents who were forced out by the old HOA have moved back to the neighborhood. The new Accessibility Fund has already helped finance modifications for 12 homes. Final edit. For those asking how to fight HOA discrimination in their own communities, my sister says to document everything, know your rights, and don't be afraid to seek legal help. Change is possible when people stand together against injustice. The next one is titled Landscaper Survey. About 3 years ago, my wife and I bought our house. We realized at the time that most of the house maintenance was poorly maintained. Renters used to live in the house before us. One of the larger projects that needed to be done was a full driveway replacement, as the original driveway hadn't been refinished or maintained in almost 30 years. Knowing that we would need to replace the driveway, my wife and I started planning ahead for the eventual project. We decided at the time that we would also like to expand our driveway. We are one of only 3 houses in my neighborhood to not have a 3-car garage. So we decided that we would expand our driveway out so that we could at least have a 3rd stall, even if it was outside of our garage. In order to expand the driveway, we had to get 3 bids out. Bid 1 was for the driveway people themselves. 1 was to our underground sprinklers maintenance, as the expansion would move our existing lines. And finally, due to our land not being 100% flat, the final bid was to a landscaper to build a retaining wall in order to create a flat enough spot to expand our driveway. Due to the various companies working on this project, it meant that we had to make sure all 3 companies could work within the same timelines. The sprinklers were simple enough and not really an issue. The driveway people were great and gave us over a month of wiggle room to make everything work. The problem came from the landscaping company. We made them intimately aware of our timelines and explained the scope of the work, and they assured us multiple times that the deadlines would work. We had the landscapers scheduled for the first week after the driveway was ripped up. However, the landscapers never showed up. We called and rescheduled for the next week, and again the landscapers didn't show up. This happened twice more before it was literally the day before the driveway. People were due back to finish the driveway and the landscaping still was not done. The landscapers finally showed up, and I talked to them before I left for work that day, gave them my cell phone and some gatorods before I left, and told them if there were any issues to please call me immediately. Got home from work to find 0 progress done on the project. Turns out the second I had left, the landscapers packed up and went to another job. I actually called the owner and bitched out his team. I have never been so mad about something. The project manager called me back and assured me that they wanted the driveway done first and the landscaping would follow, and that he personally would fix anything that was messed up as a result. Fine. The driveway was poured and the results were to be expected. Pretty brutal. About a week later, the landscapers finally built their wall and then added some finishing crap to the driveway. It looked terrible, especially for a brand new driveway. They then sent me my bill for the completed job. I immediately wrote back with pictures and explained that I was not paying for this job until it didn't look like shit and that I expected the landscapers to fix the mess they made. Well, I got ignored. At this point, they had started ignoring most of my communications. Until that is, about 3 months passed and the landscaper realized I was serious about not paying for their shoddy work. They reached out to me to figure out what was going on, which is when they finally looked at my email about the terrible work and my refusal to pay. By this point in time, it was Christmas and everything around me was frozen. The landscaper lamented not having a chance to fix their shoddy work before months had passed, and I lamented them ignoring my communications about the project being subpar in the first place. We discussed some ways to fix their fuck-up and settled on one that would at least make things look nicer, but would reduce my driveway width by about a foot, a solution I didn't like, but would at least mostly fix my issues. I left for work one day and came home to my driveway fixed. No note, no communications, they just came in and did it one day when they had time. Again, not exactly how I would have wanted it, but it was okay. My wife and I went back and forth before ultimately deciding to just pay everything, swear off the landscaper forever, and move on. The whole project had taken over 6 months, and we were just done with it all. We paid the bill and moved on. About 5 months later, just before spring/summer was set to start, the landscaper started spamming my inbox with requests for reviews. This is right when most project biddings go out, so they were looking to boost their online visibility and to get projects for the next year. I ignored the first 10 or so emails that came through before deciding, maybe I can actually write them a review. And I did. I wrote the exact experience I had with them, highlighted the lack of communication, the unprofessionalism, the frequent missed deadlines, and I even included pictures. Within a week, I received a Google reward because my review had over 1,000 views. The owner actually called me after another week and asked what he could do to make things right, which I told him that we were almost a year from the original project. Without a time machine, there wasn't much we could do. All in all, the project was kind of a failure. We expanded the driveway, but now it is a very tight squeeze, and so people rarely use the third slot. I now mostly just get mad when I see the retaining wall. I did get a ton of Google rewards for my review, and I hope it saved a ton of people the headache I went through with the landscaper. I was content with letting them screw me over and just moving on with a lesson learned, but they were persistent with their email campaign. Maybe don't ask people you screwed over to write you reviews?